Welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today we begin Module 5, which is pitch, and we'll be starting with 5.1 tuning, notation, and keys. Let's take a look at today's lesson. So today's lesson covers tuning, notation, and keys. For next time, I'm working on creating a reading of tunings, notation, keys, scales, and melodies, which will be everything included in all of Module 5, just so you have a written reference of everything we're covering. So we'll start today by talking about tuning. Then we'll talk about 12-tone equal temperament, which is the standard tuning for almost all instruments. And then we'll talk just very briefly about other tunings that are not 12-tone equal temperament. And then we'll move on to basic pitches and notation. So we're going to not cover great detail about notation in this class, but just the basics of how to find the notes and what the names of the notes are. Then we're going to wrap up today's lesson talking about key or tonality. So that means the central pitch of a song. For example, C major as a key is centered around C. So I hope you enjoy today's lesson. So in this module, we'll be discussing pitch. And I've already learned what pitch is. Pitch is the frequency of a sound, or how our ear interprets the frequency of a sound as a given note. We often use the term pitch instead of note because, technically speaking, a note is a mark on paper that's an instruction to play that pitch, whereas the pitch is the thing itself, like A440 or the C sharp below middle C. Those are pitches. So as we begin our discussion of pitch, I wanted to start with tuning. So what I mean by tuning is that's how we tune exactly the notes, both overall and in relation to each other. So if you think about a guitar or a piano, the strings on those instruments need to be tuned, and tuning is the topic of what do we tune them to. So throughout time, historically, there have been just untold numbers of tunings. If you think about going to a different place in the world hundreds of years ago, let's say you went to India and listened to some music there, you would not only hear its characteristic rhythms and melodies, but also the tuning itself of the instruments would be different than what we're used to now. And then, let's say in that same year, you traveled to Africa somehow and listened to the tuning, listened to some music there. You would also hear the instruments are tuned completely differently. Tuning is an art, and it's also a science, and there are no specific rules to tuning. So there are hundreds, thousands, and if you will, infinite different ways to tune instruments. There are some things that are in common between these tunings, but for the most part, tuning is open-ended. So in a moment, I'm going to show some tuning with sine waves, and we're going to explore freely with that. The different types of tunings that proliferated all over the world throughout time have been reduced in the last 100 years or so, maybe 150 years, as one particular tuning has risen to the forefront. And that tuning is 12-tone equal temperament. So you need to learn this term, 12-tone equal temperament, because it's the tuning of all pianos and probably 99 to 100% of the music that you hear. But I do want you to know that this tuning is relatively recent. It's only been around for a few hundred years tops, and it's only been standardized as what every instrument is tuned to for a couple hundred years, maybe 150 years. There are tunings that have, there are other tunings outside of that have 22 notes, 22 individual discrete pitches, or 9 pitches, or 150 pitches if you get really out there. But the 12 tone equal tempered system is the most common, and it's what you see on the piano and any instrument that you play in the orchestra, usually. So, just to break down that term, 12 tone equal temperament. So, there's a couple pieces of information in there. The first is that it's 12 tones per octave. So, the octave is the relationship between two of the same note in a different register, and they have a frequency relationship of 2 to 1. So, for example, 100 hertz and 200 hertz. The 200 hertz is an octave higher than the 100 hertz, and an octave below 100 hertz would be 50 hertz. So, an octave is the fundamental interval of music. It's usually heard as being the same note, but just in a different register. So, for example, on the piano, if you play an A and then you play another A, those are octaves of the same pitch. The other part of the 12 tone equal temperament system name is the equal temperament part. And what that means is that each of the 12 notes are exactly the same distance apart. So it equally divides the octave into 12 parts. So that means that if you go play two notes next to each other on an instrument, like B and C, they're exactly the same distance apart in pitch as an F sharp and a G, or as a D and an E flat, etc. So that is part of the reason why this is relatively new, is because there are reasons that we mostly won't get into, that in some tunings, in other tunings besides equal temperament, you would want notes to be placed in different places so that each interval is a different distance apart. The advantage of that would be they might be more in tune or more flexible or more creative. But the advantage of 12 tone equal temperament is that when you play in any of the 12 keys, you're playing with the same relationships. So there's no difference between those keys other than where they're located. So 12 tone equal temperament, something that you definitely need to know. It's the name for the common tuning system. It has 12 notes per octave, and they're all equally spaced. One of the ways I want to begin our exploration of tuning is to just tune freely with some sine waves and see what we get. I'm going to start with a frequency of 100 hertz here, and then I'm going to move, actually let's go with 200 hertz. That might be easier to hear. And then I'm going to move this second frequency around, and when we find something in tune, write down which of the new frequencies seemed in tune to you, seemed like something you might include in a tuning. So you don't need to remember those or anything, but you can tell that there are certain places, certain relationships between the two frequencies that are what we call consonant. And we're going to return to the terms consonant and dissonant in the next lesson. But consonant means they sound good together. So we found probably a couple, at least a few places in the scale that sounded good together. This is one of a few different ways that tunings have been created throughout time, just by moving the frequency, or you might use two strings and move the tuning of the second string to be in relation to the first one, and find what notes you like, and go with that. Of course, there are certain relationships here, what we might call ratios, in between the two frequencies that are particularly obvious as being related. So obviously 200 and 200 is the same pitch. What about 200 and 400? You noticed as these get closer and closer together, we hear this wobbling, which is called interference, beating, or difference tones. As we get close to 400, we heard that kind of thing. And then when we got exactly to 400, it's like, perfect. Perfectly in tune. In fact, these are the same note. We talked very briefly when we were talking about effects. We talked about changing the speed of playback. And when we change the speed of playback to 1/2 or double, we get a ratio of 2 to 1 between the two sounds, and that's the same as an octave. So we're going to be reviewing this term octave in a minute here. But maybe you found some other places along the way that seemed like obvious candidates for a tuning as well. I would point out 300, which is a ratio of 2 to 3. We can hear that again in a second here. That ratio of 3 to 2 is known as the perfect fifth, which is included in most tunings. One last thing is that you might remember from seeing the spectrum of different sounds in the overtone series or the harmonic series, that the harmonics of a single sound are whole number multiples of the sound of the fundamental frequency, the lowest frequency. So in fact, just within 200, if this weren't a sine wave, we would hear 400 and 600 and 800 as well. So we could hear those relationships. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll just multiply 200 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, maybe 7. Because these frequencies will be going up higher, I'm going to move this back down to 100. And so then the multiples of 100 would obviously be 200, 300, etc. So let's just hear those. These are harmonic relationships. That relates to what I will bring up as called just intonation. And it's where we're tuning to whole number ratios, 100 to 200, 100 to 300, 100 to 500, etc. So that's another way that tunings are created, is by thinking about the ratios of the two frequencies. Um, but if you like, you can find some different ways to synthesize tones on your phone or on a computer. I'm not going to go into the different programs you could use for that, but it can be fun just to think about tuning by playing around with two pitches and see what you get. Okay, so before we continue on with 12 tone equal temperament, which is our normal tuning, we're going to spend the rest of the semester talking about 12 tone equal temperament. But I just wanted to show a few things briefly about some other tunings so that you can get a sense for the fact that there are many tunings that could be used. This is basically bonus material, so this is for your information and interest. This is not on the test, as it were. So I just wanted to show you some different other ways that things can be tuned. This right here is a 31 tone equal temperament, so it has more than twice as many notes as the traditional piano. But you can see that these keys here split what we usually think about as the black keys into multiple parts, and in some cases they actually split the white keys into multiple parts so that they can get all 31 pitches. You don't need to memorize this, but it's an interesting example from Niccolo Vincentino. It's called the archicembalo, and it was invented in 1555. Just going to show you a couple other examples. This one here is 72 tone equal temperament. You can see there are 6 pianos in front of this orchestra, and the composer Georg Friedrich Haas used 6 pianos, each one tuned just a little bit apart, a 12th tone apart, to create interesting harmonies with very, very close together notes, which are called microtones. Some other interesting characters. This is Julian Carrillo, who divided the octave into many more parts than 12. In fact, he had a collection of pianos where he tuned each piano to a different number of notes per octave. In fact, he had, as you can see at the bottom here, pianos with 18, 24, 30, 36, all the way up to 96 pitches per octave. So that means there was only one octave for the entire keyboard. This is a harp that he created with 909 microtonal pitches. So these are examples of other types of tunings that involve more notes. Arabic tuning, which uses about 24 or twice as many as the normal notes. Indian tuning, which is the last one I want to show you, involves 22 pitches per octave. And you can see with the little green dots around the circle, the purple circle is the normal 12 notes per octave. You can see the little green dots where they have basically 2 versions of each pitch, of most pitches. So it's a lot like 12 tone equal temperament, but with 2 versions of each note that are slightly different. So like I said, that's basically bonus material. Just wanted to show you some other tunings that exist in the world. So now we return our focus back to 12 tone equal temperament, which is the basis for all Western classical and pop music, and we will continue our study of pitch there. So basically the only thing out of those other tuning systems that I want you to latch onto is the concept of microtonality. Microtonality relates to those tunings we just saw that have more notes than 12 in an octave. So tones are the pitches in a tuning system. So microtones are very, very small distances between notes. So instead of 12, you have, let's say, 24 or 96 notes in one octave. Then that means the notes are very, very close together, and those are called microtones. So now as we move on, what we're going to do is start to look at 12 tone equal temperament in pitch and the names and labels and notation of pitch. As I keep saying, this isn't a music theory class, so we're not going to be testing and be really, really specific about having you know all the different pitches. For example, you won't be tested on knowing, being able to identify a C sharp. However, I do want to show you the basic notation system so that you can study that further if you want to, and so that when I show examples along the way, you have the opportunity to understand that and digest it. So here we go. So the common tuning system of 12-tone equal temperament and the common notation involves 7 letter names for pitches. So those letter names just start with the letter A, they go all the way through the letter G, and then they just start over again on the letter A. So we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then it goes right back to A. So if you're new to this, it can take a minute to kind of remember that after G we don't go to H, we just turn right back around and go to A. The reason there are 7 is that 7 is the most common number of pitches in a scale, which we'll return to in the next lesson. So these are the 7 pitch letters, but you remember that we have 12 pitches per octave, so in a minute we're going to talk about how that shakes out. Let's take a look at where those land on a keyboard. This is a C. You can tell because you could find the group of 2 black notes, and it's right below that. So this is C, D, E, F, G, A. Right after the G here, we go straight back to A, B, and then C again. So this is the same note, an octave higher, and that goes up an octave, and then there's another C. So these are the white keys that are labeled here, and the black keys we'll return to in a minute, because the black keys are either sharps or flats. Or rather, they are both sharps and flats. But those are the pitch letter names. So there's this site called musictheory.net, which I'm going to show you a few visual examples on. It's a great site. It's free. And for those of you who do want to learn a little bit more about music theory and, for example, try to learn all of the major and minor scales and things like that, you're welcome to check this out and email me any questions. Music theory can be very fun. We're just going to get into the basics. So I want to show you what a staff is. So this is a staff. It's a standard 5-line staff. And the pitches, the notes go on it. And you may remember from, if you ever had a school music class, learning Every Good Boy Does Fine. That's the lines of the staff in a treble clef. So this is a staff. This is where the notes go. When they are placed in here, they need a clef so that we know what range we're reading in. So this is the treble clef, and this is the bass clef. I do want you to know these basics. This is a staff, this is a treble clef, this is a bass clef. So in the treble clef, we are playing up in a higher range. It, with this symbol, shows us where a G is, and again, you don't need to memorize where every note is, but you should know that a treble clef shows us what a dot means. Any clef does. So if we have a dot on this space, it means a different note, whether we're in this clef or this clef, or another clef. So for example, a note that would show up right here in the treble clef is an A. In fact, it's A440. If that same space were filled in with a note here in the bass clef, it'd be much lower and it'd be a C. So it shows you the range of the instrument, and it shows you what to read the notes in, so where the notes are. That's all we need to know about staff. I'm going to show you a few other things. Continuing to follow along in musictheory.net, I went to steps and accidentals. So it starts by talking about a half step, and that's an important thing to learn. So a half step and a whole step. So a half step, which is also called a semitone, is the distance from one key on the keyboard to the very next key. So that includes both white and black keys. So a half step is a note and the adjacent note next to it, like these two. So sometimes there's a black key in between the two white keys and sometimes not. So in this case, this is a half step. From here to here is a half step. It's any adjacent key. So a half step also relates to our tuning of 12-tone equal temperament. When it says 12 tones, that means 12 half steps. So if you were to count from this bottom C here to the next C, we would get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then we'd be back to C. So there are 12 half steps in the tuning. And that also is called the chromatic scale. So the chromatic scale is something that I want you to know. It's the scale that involves all of the 12 pitches. But we're going to review scales in the next lesson. So for now, I just wanted to throw that in there. So a whole step is the distance between two half steps. So for example, here 1, 2, 3. Between the 1 and the 3, you have a whole step. So from this bottom C to this C sharp is a half step. From C to D is a whole step. So if you look anywhere on the keyboard and go 2 half steps up or down, you have a whole step. So we want to learn these symbols because they're important to reading music, and they're called accidentals or sharps and flats. So this right here on the right is a sharp. It raises a note 1 half step. So if you take any note like F and you add this symbol, that makes it F sharp, and so now it's 1 half step higher. If we go back to the keyboard here, we would see F and F sharp. If we compare that then to a flat, it does the same thing, but it moves it down instead of up. So we can take any note and move it down a half step by using a flat. So if we have a B and we want to go down 1 half step, then we go to B flat. That brings up the fact that there are multiple labels for certain notes because they could be a flat note or a sharp note. So this black key right here in between C and D could be a C raised up with a sharp from C to C sharp using this sharp, or it could be a D flat, which is this D note moved down with a flat symbol. So C sharp, D flat. And that's basically all we need to know about this for now. We can add one little addendum there. We talked about sharps raising a note a half step, flats moving them down a half step. But I forgot to mention a natural, which just either cancels out a flat or sharp or is the note itself. So for example, A natural is already natural if we just say A, but we might need to use this natural symbol if we had before that an A flat. So something like A flat is lower than A, which is lower than A sharp. So if we return to this from musictheory.net, we can kind of follow up on how many pitches there are here. So there are 7 white keys per octave, and in the next lesson we'll talk about how that creates a major scale. So there are 7 white keys. Notice that in 2 places there is no black key in between. It's right here between E and F and here between B and C. The black keys, there are 5 of them per octave. They make a pentatonic scale. So like we talked about, these keys can be called either, flats or sharps, but there's only one note there in between. It's just a context distinction. Depending on what key you're in, you may call it one or the other. But what's important to note is that we have 7 letter names, A through G, and we have 12 pitches per octave. So we have all the natural notes, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and we have the sharp/flat notes, which we could say either way: D flat, E flat, G flat, A flat, B flat, or C sharp, D sharp, F sharp, G sharp, and A sharp. You don't have to memorize that, just know how many notes there are in an octave and how many letter names there are. So the last topic we're going to cover for today is keys. So as a song exists in a key, it has a central place that it calls home, a central pitch. So this is slightly different than a scale, but a key is the home base for a song, or for a section of a song at least. So if I were to play some chords, I'm going to be playing an E major chord. I'll play an A major chord, E major, B major. So we haven't gotten to chords yet, but this will help me show what a key is. So there are 3 chords here: E major, A major, and B major. If I were to play a song with these 3 chords, depending on the context, this will give us a clue as to what the key of the song is. So a key is larger than just a chord, it's larger than a scale or a melody. It is the home base place of the song. So this example, E. C sharp minor chord. So with all 4 of those chords, we start to get a sense of the key. The key is, in this case, E major. So E major, we'll learn, could be a chord, it could be a scale, or it could be a key, or it could be all 3 of those. So the key of this, what I was just playing, is E major. And this is it. Again, we're not going to be tested on finding these sorts of things, but if you're curious, a good way to try to find out what key something is in is to listen and see if you can move your voice around or an instrument around until you get to Do, or you get to the bottom of the scale, or you get to what feels like home. So I just sang up a scale, but as you're listening to the song, you could just kind of hold a note like da. If I went to this note, da, that is not the key, that's not the tonal center. That was an A. It's in the key, but it's not the center of the key. So I do think these things can be a little bit hard to explain because essentially it's such a large concept to, or it's a large bit of music that we summarize as a key. So what I mean by that is you could play for 5 minutes with a bunch of different chords and a bunch of different notes that you're singing or playing, but there's only one key. And that's not always true. Of course, a song can change key. In fact, so as I was saying, a song can change key. For example, in pop music, if I were to move up a half step with the key, I could go from the key of E to the key of F. And so, for example, so you'll hear that kind of shift sometimes, where you hear the same relationships, the same melody, but the key has changed. So that might be a good example of to help you think about what key is. But simply put, it's the home base note for the song. And usually, when we define key, we give two pieces of information. One, the pitch that is the tonal center or the do of that key. So in this case, it was E. And then we also usually give a distinction of whether the song is in major or minor. And we're going to return to the details of major and minor as we talk about scales next time. But for now, here's the sound of E major. Da, 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 and here is the sound of E minor. I'm just making this up, but in terms of what the music is, but that was E minor. So for now, you can just think of major as being the part of the tonality. It's usually brighter. Sometimes people say it's happier. Or minor, which is a little darker and can be more sad, but it also can be just as easily happy. It has a different sound. The key difference there is there are different notes in the major versus the minor. So if you were to look at the key signature for E minor, there's one sharp. The key signature for E major has 4 sharps. You can think about that as there are different notes in the scale or in the key, but both of them are centered around E. So their tonal center or the key center is E, and then it's a distinction between major or minor. So when you give a key, usually someone says this is in D minor. So you're telling them the tonal center and whether it's major or minor. So how many possibilities does that give to our normal 12 tone equal temperament scale? How many key possibilities if major and minor are an option, and you can build a key anywhere? So the answer then would be there are 24, because you could have any of the 12 pitches be the key center or the tonal center. And then either they could be major or minor on any of those. So if you count through all the 12 keys and you have your major and your minor, that's 24 different normal keys that are possible. To wrap up today's lesson, I just want to talk about a couple things to help try to zoom in on what key is. And so I just want to talk about the difference between a chord and a key. So when we get to the harmony module, we'll be talking about chords. But a chord is a collection of a few notes. This guitar E major chord has 3 different notes in it, E, G sharp, and B. But a chord can happen, this chord can happen in many keys. It could happen in the key of E, but it could also happen in the key of A. It could happen in the key of B. It could happen in the key of C sharp minor. It could happen in a variety of places. So a chord is just a single instance of certain notes, whereas a key lasts longer than that. It involves many related chords, and it's the central place of the song. Then I want to talk about the difference between a key and a scale. So a scale, which we'll get to next time, is specific notes that are ordered to go up or down. That's a scale. And it's very closely related to a key, because in a key, it's assumed that you will use the notes from that scale in the key, but you don't have to. So a scale is just literally usually 7 notes, maybe more or less, but usually 7 notes, ordered to be to move up or down like that. So scale is not really so much music per se. It could occur in music, but it's more of an isolated ordering of pitches, whereas a key is something that we feel in music as a central home base, um, as we hear a variety of melodies or harmonies, and we always come back to that basic tonal center. Last thing for this lesson is the terms diatonic and chromatic. The term diatonic means when the notes that you hear are in the key. So that means that when we have a key and we hear the notes that we expect to, for example, in E major, I played the E major scale, and those are the notes we expect to hear. So, all of that is notes that we expect to hear in the key. So those are called diatonic pitches. The opposite of a diatonic pitch is a chromatic pitch. Now, I mentioned the word chromatic when I talked about the 12 notes per octave. In a key, there's usually only 7 notes, same with the scale. So those other 5 notes, the ones that don't fit into whatever key you're in, are called chromatic notes. So I could try to sing in a chromatic note. Da, 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 da. So I used a chord that's not normal in the key, and that da, 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 it's just one example of a chromatic note. Here's another one. Da, 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 da. In both cases, you might not hear the difference, but what I'm doing is playing slightly unexpected chords for the key. And so when we have a pitch occur either in a chord or in a melody that is unexpected and it is not from the key, it's called a chromatic pitch. So usually you'll have 7 diatonic and 5 chromatic pitches. So that wraps up our first lesson of this module. So next time we'll be going on to talk about scales and melody. So we'll get a little bit deeper into the pitches that are involved in scales and some variety therein. As you can tell from the way I'm talking about this stuff, it's one of the challenges of this class because, as we know, we have a mix of people who know music theory, who have played instruments, and people who don't, and both are equally welcome in this class. So I've spent a lot of time trying to think about the ways that we can engage you with these topics without pushing those two groups of people too far away. And what I've settled on is the information that I've shared with you so far and what's coming up. Basically the nuts and bolts, the basics of terms and how this music notation stuff works. And then, again, you're pretty much just responsible for the concepts and these basic terms. And as usual, when the quiz is coming up, I will be outlining the terms that you need to know on the terms and topics list for that. So I hope you enjoyed this. For those of you who are interested in looking more into keys, something that's really fun is to try to listen along to some of your favorite music and find where the key center is. And it can be hard to check yourself. Maybe you want to wait to look it up online and just see if you can find it first with your voice, moving your voice around and finding the place that feels like home or do. All right, that's all for today, and we'll see you in the next lesson.